what happened with the hadiths after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? We know that the Prophet gave us the Quran and his Sunnah, the actions that he had, the many narrations that he stated. Even simple matters like the Salah, which the Prophet used to do 5 times a day at least in front of Muslims, that was disputed. What happened after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? First of all, when we go to the Prophet's life, we see the Prophet instructed his companions to write the hadith. Yes, we do have sources from Sunni and Shia books that tell us some companions went to the Prophet. That particular companion, he told the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, should I write everything you say? Because the Quraysh, the people, the Meccans, they saw me writing what you say. They objected to me. They told me Muhammad is a human being. He gets angry. He says things. Why are you writing everything he says? So, Ya Rasulullah, should I stop? Should I write? What did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam tell him? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam took an oath in God. He told him, I swear by the one who has my soul in his hand. Everything I say is haqq, it's truth. Write everything I say. The Prophet actually encouraged the companions to write. Now remember, there weren't many writers at the time, especially in early Islam. In fact, some historians tell us when the Prophet received wahi in Mecca, there were just a handful of people in Mecca who even knew how to read and write. So there weren't many people who were literate, who were able to read and write. But those who were able to write, the Prophet ﷺ instructed them. He gave them a command to write, and many of them did. What happened after the Prophet ﷺ passed away? Let me share with you sources from Sunni books that tell us what happened after the Prophet. Let's start with Abu Bakr, the first caliph. Aisha narrates a hadith. She says, when my father became the Khalifa, I realized at night he had trouble sleeping. He didn't sleep that night. He would go from one position to another position, and he was disturbed. Then in the morning, I told him, my father, what's wrong with you? You couldn't sleep well. He said, yes, there was something on my mind. He tells his daughter Aisha to go into his room and to pull out a stack of papers. She goes and she gets them, and she realizes these are hadiths. Hadiths that Abu Bakr, he himself had written, hearing from the Prophet. 500 hadiths. 500 according to Sunni sources. Then he lights a fire, and he takes the 500 hadiths and he burns them. Aisha herself is perplexed. She's surprised. What's going on? Why are you burning your hadiths? He tells her, look, I don't want the hadith to get confused with the Quran, mixed with the Quran, so I figured the best is to just, burn them. Maybe some people will misunderstand the hadith. This was his justification. So he himself, he burns 500 hadiths. Now he rules for 2 years. After him, Umar ibn al-Khattab comes. Umar ibn al-Khattab takes it to a higher level. You know what he does? He gathers the companions. He tells them, I have an idea. Should we collect the hadith of the Prophet like we collected, the Quran, and we had it fully compiled to make sure Muslims know what the Quran is? Should we do the same thing to the hadith, or should we not? Most of the companions told him, yes, we should gather the hadith as well to preserve the hadith. He tells them, okay, I give you 1 month. I give you 1 month. Go and collect the hadith so we work on them. Now what did they think, the companions? That they will bring the hadiths and he will do a committee, form a committee, and they will preserve the hadith. They will gather it and make it into a book. So he gives them 1 month. Companions from all over the Muslim Ummah, they bring the hadiths which they had recorded directly from the Prophet ﷺ. They submit it to Umar ibn al-Khattab. At the end of the month, when he's gathered thousands of hadiths, do you know what he does to them? He burns all of them. And then they tell him why. He says, Mishnat ka mishnat ahl al-kitab. He says, you know, the Jews, they mixed their hadiths, their commentaries, scholarly opinions with the Torah, and that's how they messed up the Torah. We don't want the same happening to the Quran. We want to keep the book of Allah. Hasbuna kitab Allah. The book of Allah is enough. Now, my brothers and sisters, the Quran doesn't give us the details about everything. The Quran gives us general guidelines. The Quran says pray, but how many rak'ahs does the Quran say? No. How do you observe those rak'ah? It doesn't tell you. What invalidates your fast? The 10 things that invalidate the fast. The Quran doesn't tell us. The Quran gives us general guiding principles. Now you had thousands and thousands and thousands of hadiths that were lost because of this. And there was a prohibition. For 100 years, there was man' tadween al-hadith. There was a prohibition on recording the hadith. He himself, Umar ibn al-Khattab, if he would see anyone narrating the hadith, discussing the hadith in the masjid or elsewhere, he would beat them with his stick. Even Abu Huraira, by the way. You know, Abu Huraira is their favorite narrator, right? In the beginning, Umar banned him from narrating the hadith. He would actually beat him with a stick if he would see him narrating the hadith. Then later, they started making exceptions when they realized Abu Huraira is politically on their side. Then they allowed him to narrate the hadith. But initially he was banned. Most Muslims were banned. And this lasted for 100 years. With the exception of the 4 years in which Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib ﷺ ruled, he lifted the ban. But the Bani Umayyah, for 100 years, they imposed a ban on the recording of hadith. When was it lifted? 100 years later, during the ahd of who? Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. He came during his rule and he lifted the ban. He allowed the Muslims to, exchange the hadith. Now, brothers and sisters, when you have 1 century of no discussion of the hadith of the Prophet, one thing that supports this, if anyone wants to dispute this, first of all, we have the historical evidence. I ask you the question, all the books of hadith, like Bukhari, Muslim, Ibn Dawood, Tirmidhi, how come you don't see any one of these books in the 1st century? In the first 100 years after the Prophet. Why? Because there was no hadith. It was banned. You couldn't produce a book. They came centuries later. Bukhari came over 200 years after the Prophet. Because right after the Prophet, there was a ban on recording the hadith. You don't have a single work of hadith from that era. Because there was a ban. Now imagine what happened to the Muslims. That's why there are some companions who say, Bukhari actually narrates this. There are some companions who say when Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam became the Khalifa, the apparent Khalifa, he is the real Khalifa of course, and he prayed in the masjid of the Prophet, one of the companions said what? ذكرنا بصلاة محمد صلى الله عليه وآله. Zayd ibn Arqam. He said about the salah of Imam Ali, he reminded us of the salah of the Prophet. What does that mean? What does this statement like that mean? Imagine even the salah, they had changed, such that Imam Ali, when he prayed, they're like, oh, that's how the Prophet prayed. They remembered. They remembered. In fact, Imam Malik ibn Anas, you know what he says? He says, I grew up and I found that Muslims have changed everything except salah. And even the salah they've changed. Who says this? The leader of the Maliki school of thought. When you have Bani Umayyah ruling, and you had fabricators fabricating the hadith, because see, when you have now a gap, there's no hadith, how do you keep the people busy with? One way was using fabricators, who came and they fabricated the hadiths after the Prophet ﷺ for many reasons. One was the political reason. Muawiyah and Bani Umayyah, they fabricated hadiths for political reasons, to solidify their stance. That was one reason. Another reason that you had people fabricating the hadith was, for example, the ghulat. Those extremists who idolized the Ahlul Bayt, who gave them a very high status, making them God, they fabricated the hadiths. And there were some people who just wanted an important social status. They just wanted to people give them money, and they wanted to act, as if they were very important. However, the Prophet was aware of this. Now, to protect us from these fabrications, what did the Prophet say in Sahih, even Sunni sources? I leave behind you the Quran and what? Did he say was sunnati? In the Sahih original hadith? No. This was changed in some books. But if you look at the Sahih sources, the Prophet didn't say, I leave the Quran, the book of God, and my sunnah. Why didn't he say that? Even though we, of course, accept the sunnah of the Prophet and we practice by it. Because the Prophet knew his sunnah would be changed. They would burn thousands of hadith, they would fabricate hadith. When you examine the biography of the Prophet, brothers and sisters, there is so much injustice done to the Prophet ﷺ. So much injustice. From the day he starts receiving revelation, you see the injustice. You know, they give you that image of the Prophet being traumatized. And, you know, he says, Jibreel was squeezing me, suffocating me. To the point where some sources in these other schools of thought, they say the Prophet actually tried to commit suicide. Can you believe that? He wanted to jump from the cliff. Jibreel had to convince him not to. You see this nonsense? So what's sunnah? What sunnah are you supposed to follow? That's why the Prophet says, I leave the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt, the Itra. They will protect my sunnah. That's why if you want the sunnah of the Prophet, you go through the Ahlul Bayt. They are the only ones who have the authentic sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. If you take the correct teachings of Ahlul Bayt, the Ahlul Bayt tell you who the Prophet is. You know, there are some schools of thought, they tell us, you Shia are obsessed with the Ahlul Bayt. Habibi, I am obsessed with the Ahlul Bayt because the Ahlul Bayt tell me who the Prophet is. If you don't want me to go to the Ahlul Bayt, I will not know who my Prophet is. There's a different picture of the Prophet if you go to other schools of thought. The Ahlul Bayt tell us the rahmah of the Prophet, the true image of the Prophet, the true seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's why we hold on to them. And that's why the Prophet says, I leave after me the book of Allah, wa itrati. The later Imams of Ahlul Bayt, they corrected the image for us. After the 100 years of the hadith being banned, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, they came and they told us what's right, what's wrong. And we hold on to them. We're not saying that everything in Bukhari or Muslim or Tirmidhi or, for example, Ibn Majah, Musnad Ahmad, Ibn Dawood, that everything is false. No. There are thousands of hadith in Sunni books which we accept. They are beautiful hadiths, moral teachings, and some of it is true from the Prophet's life. We're not dismissing all of that, but we're saying that everything in Bukhari and Muslim and others, we cannot say it's sahih. There are fabrications and there are authentic hadiths. So we have to use the intellect God has given us, and we have to see if this is compatible with the Quran or no. Is this acceptable to logic or no? Just because something is in Bukhari, I accept it? No. Just because something is in Kafi, I accept it? No. We have to use the intellect and see what's right from what's wrong.